Hi, I'm back. It's Mrs. Brandt with AP Human Geography. I was thinking about films, and today I was thinking about Talladega Nights and how I like to talk with my hands, and I don't know what to do with my hands. But today I think we're going to shake and bake, baby. So here we go. That's all right, you can groan. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to transfer over to taking a look at today's lesson. You would think I am smoother at this by now, but here we go. So again, my name is Kristen Brandt, and I am from Glenbard West High School in Glen Ellen, Illinois. Not so fun fact, I woke up to snow on the ground today, so was not super excited. Down at the bottom, you will see, we tried this yesterday and it worked pretty well, the slido.com. That is the meeting number that we're going to use. It'll be up a few times. We're going to use that today. My son Ben is helping me out today. He's super not happy to help me out, but he's a good kid. But he'll try and kind of monitor some of the questions. I know you're going to want to ask lots of questions about the test, and we're going to not answer a ton of those right now because human geo teachers, your teachers are going to get some more information tonight. There's going to be more information coming out in the next couple weeks. We're going to practice. We're setting up a new schedule so that week before we can even practice. Right now, we're trying to get us to really focus on these big ideas and how do they all connect, and kind of really focusing in on the skills and the concept and the processes. So I think I've probably stalled long enough on this screen, and that number will come up again to help you out. Today, one of my favorite units, we are going to look at agriculture and rural land use patterns and processes. If you look at the pictures down at the bottom here, these are actually from my cousins. So how do people's culture and resources available to them influence how they grow food? And so these 4 pictures are from Fort Dodge, Iowa. So western side of Iowa, and my cousins actually, again, we're going to take a look at why they're burning the fields later, but we'll talk about commercial farming and how that impacts kind of the culture of an area. But speaking of agriculture, these are our big ideas. So this is more for your teacher. This is really when we look at that idea of question it, and we're talking about culture and resources, we see it in these 6 big things. And so in 40 minutes to go through all this, that introduction to agriculture, some of these patterns, some products, kind of the von Thunen model, taking a look at the global system. We've got a lot to kind of cover, and so I'm going to try to find ways to connect everything as we're going forward. I totally am Talladega Nights, like what do I do with my hands? But before we do that, we need to practice what we did yesterday with culture. And so in terms of yesterday's FRQ, this is what I left you with. And so this one you can actually find in the AP Classroom. So if you have more questions, I'm going to kind of go through a little bit of it, but highly encourage you to get into AP Classroom and look for this one in the culture unit, because you can actually read in more detail the rubric responses. But if you were looking at this, it says to identify 2 specific means by which new expressions in popular culture are diffused globally. So what we're looking here, the internet, email, specific social media types you could use, celebrities, movies, computer, streaming. So those would all be acceptable answers. Number 2, popular culture often spreads through a combination of different types of diffusion. Describe how terms such as those below, or such as those shown in the table, diffuse spatially through each of the following processes. So if you're talking about relocation diffusion, you're going to talk about when I move to that area, I've already learned these words, so I'm going to say things such as cool or groovy. I just like saying groovy, but I'm going to continue to say it in that new area. And so when I move there, then if other people start to pick up on it, that is how it's going to diffuse through relocation. Contagious diffusion is, if you've ever watched Mean Girls where they try to make what was the word? She tried to make fetch a thing. That would have been contagious if her small group of friends would have picked up on fetch, and then it would have spread to the school, and then it would have spread beyond, and it became a thing. That would have been an example of contagious diffusion. Hierarchical diffusion with these terms here would be, let's pretend that the Kardashians started the word selfie. And so maybe it started, you know, the celebrities would start using that word. And then those of us on social media would pick up on it. And then it would eventually get to other people. And so it would spread that way. It could also be larger cities. So in a new city, you know, maybe in New York, they were using the word rad in the 1980s. And then it started there, but it didn't actually spread to other cities right away. It would kind of jump to different locations. And so that's how that would spread. Number 3, when new words diffuse, they confront barriers. So part of these always get tricky to identify and explain. So you'd want to identify, and this says 2 barriers. So I'm just going to do a couple. Again, there's a huge list in AP Classroom. Again, you're going to want to practice logging into there anyway, because this is going to make sure you've got your login code. All of that information is going to be really important as we're moving forward the next few weeks. But things such as age, right? That could be a barrier. So identifying that, well, how is that a barrier? Well, there's an age gap. You know, I still think the word cool is normal, but I would say that not everybody does. So the question, okay, I'll come back to, there was a question about how is relocation diffusion different than contagious diffusion? Give me just a second and I will come back to that. Let me finish number 3 first. Another barrier could be distance. Just because we don't come into physical contact with one another, it's sometimes tough to spread things. Linguistic barriers, if words don't always translate the same. Religious diffusion, like, could be a barrier just because there's certain customs or things that prohibit words from diffusing. How about political could be a barrier? Maybe the country's censorship and they're going to say ban certain words or certain phrases. And then economic could be a barrier, access to these terms. So this came up, so that gives you some ideas. Again, please go in and look at AP Classroom for more information. But here's what I will tell you. I think this came up a little bit yesterday that some of you guys are trying to split hairs, really parsing out like what exactly is the difference. Things are not that clean in AP Human Geo, and that's when we talk about relocation diffusion and contagious diffusion, because it is possible that both could happen. I relocate, I bring something, and then it takes off. Yeah, both could be happening at the same time, or because of one another. And so I think that in your mind, though, think what happens first. So relocation, somebody moves from one place to another and they bring it with them. That's going to be your cleanest definition of relocation. Contagious, they're not going to talk about the movement. They're just going to talk about an individual starting something or having something, and then it spreads outward from there. But yes, they can totally be connected, but it's really 2 things happening at once. Okay, so again, AP Classroom. That exam information is going to be coming. So again, Ben is not going to give me a ton of those questions, maybe at the end if there's something that keeps popping up. But here's what I'm going to tell you to really focus on. So you're going to see question 1 and question 2. We're going to practice timing. We're going to do all of that. So hang in there. You got a few more weeks of this. But what we want to start being able to do is to find the thread. Like, what are those themes we keep seeing over and over again? We're going to practice the timing of these 2 questions, the 25 minutes and the 15 minutes. So please don't panic about that. We want to make sure you're expressing your ideas and you're connecting them. So it's not just about memorization. If you have not picked that up from this class, you cannot memorize your way through it. You have to be able to connect and explain and give examples. If you can do those things, you're going to be awesome. The more examples you can give us, the better, because then we're going to be able to demonstrate that knowledge in a variety of ways. So again, Slido. And here is the number 43148. Okay, so here we go. So what we want to focus on, so we're talking about those connections. So explain the connection between physical geography and agricultural practices. So as a geographer, as a student of geography, you want to be able to say, okay, if somebody says something in the tropics, what type of crops would be there? And then what do I know about that area? Like, if I know that they're growing these types of crops, what does it say about their economy, their level of development, their population? How can I connect all of that? So when I look at this map, you're going to say, okay, I see we've got some extensive cropping systems. We're going to get to that definition again in just a second. I've got, I look through here and I see this red, we've got intensive cropping, but you should say, okay, here's what I know. I know we've got some Mediterranean through here. I know they're going to grow rice here. I know we're going to grow some wheat, some corn. Okay, now let's add in some of those examples and those specifics based off of climate. Part of what else we look at is that what land is actually even arable. Okay, and so that's being able to actually use the land. And so we see heavy use of areas such as India. Even take a look at South Africa. You know, that idea of how we're going to try and maximize what we can do there. You're going to look at Africa and you're going to say, Mrs. Brandt, it looks like they are farming. We're going to talk about nomadism again. We'll talk about irrigation to some extent, but you'll notice that they're not able to use it as extensively because of the climate that's there. So when we talk about agricultural systems and we talk about being able to draw those conclusions. So when you see a map like this, so climate and crop, you should say, where is this located? Okay, around the Mediterranean Sea. Oh, there's a climate region, Mediterranean. Okay, what are those crops? And I know your teachers have said this over and over again. They have probably said olives and grapes. And so when we talk about those crops, okay, that's because it reflects the climate. And so then we go, okay, what do we know is grown in those regions, but also tourism. You know, that brings a lot of people. When we talk about grapes, we talk about producing wine. We talk about California. My brother went to South America and he brought home some beautiful Chilean wine when he traveled there for the family. But that idea of understanding the climate helps us to understand then the locale, the culture of the people. So here's another example. You're saying, Mrs. Brandt, this is huge. Correct, it's the tropics. So you should then start thinking what crops are growing there. And hopefully you came up with different fruits. Maybe we've got some root vegetables, and so some cassava. You might have some sweet potatoes. You might have some bananas, some sugar cane. So all of those things that are going to come out of the tropics. So that's what I need you to take from this first part, is that we look at the climate and what type of crops are going to come from that area. Then we start talking about farming practices. So I'm going to first talk about intensive farming practices. Okay, so the definition of intensive is typically we see less land. Okay, and so, but we're able to produce more. And so a lot of times, and this is going to contradict here, and I probably should have flipped my sides, but a lot of times when we use less land, so it's going to have a higher yield. And so when we talk about intensive, we're going to see machines and fertilizers. We're going to see it takes money to do these things. So one of the questions that just came in is, can religion affect agriculture? Absolutely, in some of those practices. And so I'm going to have Ben kind of keep that as in the back of our mind as we're moving forward, especially when we get to animal crops. Okay, so that idea of market gardening, when we talk about where it has to be located, so we'll come back to that when we talk about the Van Thunen model, but here we're talking about intensive. I mean, even look at the setup here. You know, we're going to have some high irrigation systems. They've got to cover some stuff. You know, they're really trying to get the most out of their land to get the best produce. We also know, though, that high yields can happen in plantation agriculture. And so I chose two in particular here that I think also connect to other ideas. And so the two I chose, take a look at coffee growing countries. So you should notice that they are located throughout the tropics. You should notice that a lot of these are going to be, for the most part, we'd say LDCs. Some are Brazil and Mexico and India, we could say are our nations in transition. But you should then start to think, okay, what impact does that have? What type of crop is coffee? Tea we could put in the same category, or this is cocoa, sorry. We could put cocoa in the same category. Look at a lot of the same crops or the same countries. Both of those are things we would call luxury crops. So they're going to have high yield. People are working the land pretty hard. It's going to take some money. But what we know is if that crop fails, a lot of times the economy of that area fails as well. Other plantation practices, we take a look at sugarcane. We take a look at bananas, we could look at rubber industry. So that idea of large amounts of resources kind of going into it. And so when I think of plantation, I think of typically there's some sort of outside corporation or single owner that employs people then to do this. And so they're really dependent on that person or that company or that country in this instance. We also would say that we have intensive farming practices. Oh, great question. So when we talk about yield, okay, so intensive farming practices and yield is how much does it produce? So we would say rice is a high yield crop. In other words, this little piece of land can produce like this. It's bigger than that. I'm just trying to kind of show you here. So it's going to, a little bit produces a ton. Some of them, when we talk about low yield, and we're going to get there, it doesn't produce as much, and it's going to happen for a lot of different reasons. So on the same amount of land, it's not going to produce as much. So this, if you live in the Midwest, you actually know this. And so when we talk about mixed crops and livestock systems, if you've ever left the city or if you live in any of these areas, you've driven by it. So first of all, when we talk mixed crops in the Midwest, I need you to think of two crops. You should think of corn and soybeans. And I continuously tell my students, this is not the corn that you and I eat. This is the corn that the animals eat. That's why it's mixed crop livestock systems. And so we want to take the yield, the product, the corn, and then we're going to feed the animals. Okay, and so you can see in the background here, you can see the crops in the background, and you can see it's supposed to be this integrated system of how it's supporting one another. Okay, so then we also look at extensive farming practices. So extensive then, typically more land, but really it's about lower yield, because this is where I don't necessarily like the definition, because I don't think of shifting cultivation as huge amounts of land, but for an individual, it would be larger. But that's not going to yield as much, so it doesn't produce as much. You don't get as much off of that land, okay? And part is because of the practices that they're using. They don't have a lot of the machinery that we're going to see in intensive. They don't have as much of the money. They don't have and then the crop itself just doesn't produce as much. Yeah, plantation farming can be extensive as well. I just used what came from your AP Human Geography CED, so the course and exam description. So that's what I was following, but you're absolutely correct. This is where when you go to write things, don't get hung up on the little nitty gritty things. Get hung up on the explaining, get hung up on giving examples, because that's what we're looking for. Do you understand really what's going on? So for example, if you never use the phrase extensive farming practices, I really don't care. But should you know that shifting cultivation is slash and burn, takes place in the tropics, and when we take a look at it, they come in slash, they burn, and it's only going to produce a lot of goods for a few years, because it's going to suck the nutrients out of the ground, and then eventually it cannot produce and it cannot keep up with that land. So what do people do? They move on to a new plot of land. And this is a problem when we start looking at where it's happening in areas such as our rainforest. Another thing that we watch that think about doesn't produce a lot, we would talk about nomadic herding. Okay, and so that idea of moving your animals to find pastures. So I really worked on pronunciating that, by the way, because that is not an easy word for me to say. But that idea of going to find different plots of vegetation for these animals. Notice how arid this is where the cattle are located. And so trying to find that, this also causes desertification, because as they eat the vegetation, then in drier areas, the desert then continues to grow because it has nothing to hold it in place. So again, if you can remember this, extensive farming does not have a high yield. Okay, not going to make a ton of money. Intensive, high yield, making money. Go with that. Okay, that's going to be your simplest definition. And I've oversimplified it, by the way. Okay, so nomadic herding is another example of this. Not a lot of yield. Remember, mostly going to feed the people that think more subsistence, going to feed the people that it's there for, that are living there. they're only going to eat the meat when they need it. They're going to take the milk from the cows or the goats, and so they're going to use that material that way. Ranching is another one we would say extensive, because what's going to happen, think about the amount of land that they're going to use, even though they might produce quite a bit of meat, but not compared to how much land they're on. And so, think of your, in the Pampas, think of the gauchos, think of, this is where they're using that open farmland to move animals. Yet ranching is different than raising cattle for beef. And because ranching is going to be more sustainable, it's going to focus more on grass-fed versus the feedlots that we find a lot in the United States, because they're going to confine the animals. And so that's going to be more intensive because they're going to be able to produce more. So we do think things that I would always point out, and one of the questions that you asked me earlier was about religion and impacting. Take a look at India. And you should go, number of cattle, that makes sense in India, right? However, would it surprise you if I said that they're one of the leaders also in beef production? And you would say, but Mrs. Brandt, I thought cows were sacred. And you're correct. But at some point you can't have, a million head of cattle like roaming around either. And so there's kind of a way of, they're also making, how do you keep kind of moving things through the system? So even though they're not going to consume it, they are still going to sell some of it as well. Okay, and so this is just looking at livestock production. If you wanted, but if we talk about that idea of grazing, and so this is really what I wanted to point out. So really, we're not going to see a lot of grazing in India. You're going to see more of the mix. The grazing, though, this is in that plateau of Tibet, the grazing along the Sahel, right along the Sahara Desert. So really using that large amounts of land. So the difference between ranching and cattle farming. So I would say the better question is, what's the difference between ranching and feedlots? So cattle farming, I think that you're going to see more of that integration between, if I go back, sorry. Here in this image, more of that integration between the animals and the land. Ranching, think of people that it's this wide open area. It's not as practical in the United States anymore because of how we own the land, and moving animals between states has become more complicated. I would say where you're really probably going to want to know is, what's the difference between ranching and feedlots? I think that's the better question that could show up someplace. Feedlots then are going to be really intense. We're going to put cattle in a small amount of area. They're going to eat the corn and, kind of that type of meal instead of grass. And it's all about plumping them up and getting them ready for market. Ranching is also going to be about getting them to market, but it's along the way they're eating the grass. Okay. So we're going to shift off of that a little bit. And we're going to talk about things that geographers also look at, and we look at these rural settlement patterns. Okay. And so one of the things that we talk about are kind of, what do you see? And I talk to my students, if you've ever had an opportunity to fly, that would be great. But if you even just Google some of this stuff, it's just beautiful. I was telling our producer just how much I enjoy looking at these images. In fact, it's interesting. Do you see the one here? It's the second kind of band down with the circles. This is actually in Kansas, but we were driving through part of Kansas, Nebraska a few years ago, and I called my cousin who was in Iowa. I go, dude, what is up with the circles? Like, I just don't understand it. And he goes, oh, well, it's pretty easy. There's an irrigation system. So they talk about in the center of the land, and then the irrigation system kind of operates in a circle. So you understand kind of the resources then. So we're going to talk about a few of these different patterns. You can look up definitions. What I want to start talking about are more of those connections, okay? So this one here, when we talk about the meets and bounds survey method. Okay, so meets and bounds, we see this a lot in Europe. We see it a lot because it's slower development as far as people were already established. And so really it was based off of that natural resource and went from there. So using the natural landmarks to build it. And then today we'd even say some man-made landmarks, and then kind of drawing your, here we're going to use the landmarks to help kind of come up with what land we're going to use to farm. And so you'll see in the image to the right, it seems a little more haphazard. when we look at meets and bounds, but it does actually make sense if you saw the landmarks that help to block it out. Okay. In the United States, because once we were settled and then as we moved westward, we could be a little more organized in how we divvied up land. And we did a method of township and ranges. And so if you remember your land ordinance, I believe 1787, I should have looked that up, I apologize. But the land ordinance that really had us look at township and range. And so you're talking about that grid system that we have today. Much easier to say, I'm going to give you a mile by a mile, which is a little over 600 acres, and you're going to put your home on it, and that's going to be your plot. And so if you've ever had an opportunity to kind of go west and look at our plots, you're going to see that grid system. Okay. And what we mean about surveying a settlement is what we're doing is we're putting boundaries. We're putting those markers of this is the land that now belongs to me. In Europe, they also use this and we see this also in Canada, they call it this long lots method. And it was to try and balance it out. Because here, when we just did these grid systems, at the end of the day, you might get some really good land and I might get some really bad land. The long lots was designed to give everybody kind of the same type of land. And so you would have the same type of soil. And so everybody would have these really long lots, but they would have the same 3 types of soil. And so it was trying to just make things a little more balanced as they were developing that area. I mean, let's be honest, in westward expansion, it was all about the land grab. They didn't care. It was just about having land. It didn't always have to be good. Here, I would say in Canada, and in Europe, when they were able to, they were just a little more purposeful in trying to balance it out. Okay, something else that we look at is we look at the amount of labor that is used. So what do you notice in this map here? So the percent of people of working age who are engaged in activity to produce goods or services in the agricultural sector. So typically we would say this is for the most part, primary activity. The higher numbers tend to be in our LDCs, correct? Or our nations in transition. Well, why is that? Well, if you remember back to that opening slide where I showed some of the farm equipment, it's crazy expensive. Okay. There's a culture of people working in the land. And so if you're working, so people would have lots of children to help work the land, but you can't all of a sudden say, okay, well, now we're all going to use machines. The rest of you, good luck. And so what's the transition then to move more into that system as well? Also, some of the land just is not suitable for all of that. Even in the United States, we see some trends as well. Taking a look at employment of agricultural workers, it shouldn't surprise you when you look at our Western states that are going to have higher percentage of people engaged in agriculture. What crop would we probably see down here? The types of crops you should see things such as, definitely citrus in some areas, maybe some cotton in other areas. I know that in some over here too, a lot of chicken farms as well. And really what we're leading to is the difference between commercial and subsistence agriculture. So here, when we talk subsistence, okay, remember typically we're going to be smaller, more focused on feeding the community. We're going to be focused more on, so people always talk about just feeding, growing enough to feed for yourself. Food for yourself. Yes and no. I mean, typically it tends to be more community-based than that. And so that's where this term comes. When you look at this map here, you definitely should say, okay, the green, I see shifting, that's rainforest. Okay, I should start thinking of small groups of people. And remember, that's our slash and burn. We're going to talk about rice here in just a little bit. Let me come back to that. But we also did pastoral nomads already. They put Mediterranean in here. I actually wouldn't put it there, even though this map did. I think they were just trying to show you in that type of climate region, because I do want to talk about wet rice. Okay, and so when we talk about wet rice is very labor intensive. Okay, and so that's one of the reasons that it stays in that intensive category. We also talk about that it is very high yield, produces a lot. Okay, and especially if we can double crop. In India, remember, they're trying to triple crop. And so that just means getting more in a season. But to look at first of all, if you've never spent some time looking at these images, they're just gorgeous. This was from the Atlantic.com, by the way. They had like just a ton to choose from. But we look at how they terraced farm, and so because it takes so much, you've got to wet the field. Then we got to start growing. We got to plant stuff by hand. Then we're going to gather. We're going to plow, and then we're going to. I mean, if you've ever gone through it, then there's the thrashing, the willowing. Again, you don't have to memorize all that. What you need to understand is just it's very labor intensive, but it is high yielding. And so when we say that it is still that intensive subsistence, so yes, they might sell to other people, but their primary focus, hello, there's a billion people in China. We got a billion people in India. And so a lot of that focus is on feeding their community first and foremost. That intensive piece is going to be not a ton of land, high yield, lots of labor. So how does all of this connect? And a lot of it connects to land prices too, or what is that climate? I mean, notice here when we look at the rice fields, I mean, so we're terracing up into the mountains, the hillsides. We're trying to use as much land as possible. Sometimes that's not always possible. Especially when we look at things around us and look at how the crop land values throughout time. I mean, look at how that land has skyrocketed throughout the Midwest here, and just in how much it costs to even own land. And then you take a look at it's not just here. In India, we've seen the same thing, that exponential, it feels like, curve of the farmland. Part is because a lot of the good farmland is on the outskirts of cities. And what do we know what's happening with cities? Well, they're putting pressure on that land. And so people then are competing for, is this going to stay farmland? Is this going to transfer over to becoming an urban area? And that's going to cost land to go up and up and up. Well, what we're really talking about is kind of this idea of ownership. As well. And so back to gender equity, because that's a theme we continuously see throughout. And so you'll see just how few areas women actually even own any of the land. And so that also gives you some insight into patriarchal versus matriarchal society, that idea of gender equity. And you'll even see in the United States, not as many here. I even think about, my grandfather owned the land, his grandfather, so my great grandfather, then my grandfather, my dad now owns it. And so eventually when my dad passes, I'll own it, and I will be the first female in like 4 generations that will have her name on part of that land. And so it tended to be more of a to own the land tended to be more patriarchal. And so it'll take some time to see more equality there. But what we're really talking about too, when we're talking about those land prices, is all about the market. So a lot of different versions of this model out there, and I know I'm going to get questions about memorizing each one of these. But what I really need you to focus on is it's all about transporting the goods to the market. Okay. Remember, Von Thunen's model is technically outdated today. It's outdated because of how our cities have developed, but also it's outdated because of transportation improvements, refrigeration, preservatives, other things that we've done. So then the question I always get, then why the heck do we have to look at it? Because what it does tell us is makes us think about still the why of the where. And so historically versus the today helps us to understand how communities developed at one point. So for example, if the market is the black dot in the middle here, then we have our farming and our dairying. And really, they're there. I'm going to jump for a second because of they were highly perishable. Okay, so even today, you're still going to see dairy cows or dairy farms in highly populated areas. In other words, if I go to the Northeast, I'm still going to find dairy farms not in New York City, but in upstate New York, because I still don't want my milk transporting, hundreds and thousands of miles, because the shelf life just isn't going to be that long. And so we talk about milk shed. We also talk about perishability of our produce. And so being able to be closer to the market, because even think about it, even with all of the things we have today, it's still going to cost more if I have to worry about refrigeration and getting stuff to the market. So then we also talk about forests. And this is the one my students are like, I just don't get this one, Mrs. Brandt. I wouldn't spend a ton of time on it. At the end of the day, the forest used to be the next ring because lumber was heavy, and this is how we were building our cities. Today, not really practical because we've kind of torn down that ring. We don't necessarily need the barrier anymore. And so we think about areas, we still have areas, but they're going to be outside the city. And then we find different regions within the US where we're going to grab that. Then we went to extensive field crops. And so that idea of more land, but maybe not as high of yield, but it was really more about space. And then finally, you would put your ranching and animal products probably far away, partly because of smell, but also space. And then you'd look for that integrated system between these rings. So there's a common, this was out there a couple different places. There's been some multiple choice questions in the past that have focused on this. Your teachers may have done it with you. I would say a couple things when you see these things. When we look at A on the left, so it's trying to apply von Thunen's model to the United States and New York City as the single market. I mean, the reality is we do see, I mean, if you look at it, there is a lot of dairy farms up here. Yeah, we did see some cotton and tobacco here. I don't know what we do see corn and soybeans. We do but forests are going to be further out. At the end of the day, when they try to make these modifications, it's still inaccurate. You got to think probably a little bit smaller, and you got to think about climate, and that's what B tries to do. It tries to put in some of those climates, but you will see the band. And if it was all about getting stuff to New York City and trying to minimize those costs, what would make the most sense to do so? So there was a question, does the landscape of an area affect the von Thunen model? Absolutely. And so that's the other thing when we talk about how this is outdated. I mean, at the end of the day, this assumes that all the soil is the same in all of these rings. It assumes that all this land is flat. It assumes that transportation costs are all equal. And at the end of the day, that's just not realistic. So good question. So then as we're starting to kind of move towards the end here, we start taking a look at corporations versus individuals. And so we've kind of started to look at, so example here in Wisconsin, the number of milk cows has actually remained pretty steady. But if we look at the number of smaller farms, they've decreased. So, and the larger farms have started to increase. So there's a couple different things going on here. People are getting bought out by larger corporations. But the other thing that happens is that the number of cows can remain the same. They're producing more too, based off of hormones that we're using. It's not just if we're taking a look at cattle, it's not just cattle. And so if that interests you, get into that AP classroom. There is a practice FRQ question on that, and you can read the answers to see kind of what else they're talking about. Farms in general, as farmers grow older, we see that the average age of the farmers are starting to get older. We see that family individual owned farms, they're slowly decreasing, and maybe the corporations ones are growing a little bit, but they're still small in number compared to the family farms. Now, that being said, I will tell you, my uncle, they do corn and soybean now, but he had tried to become a hog farmer. And so I grew up kind of understanding, that what it takes to raise hogs. But eventually he couldn't compete with the corporations because he was a smaller farm. And so he got bought out. But again, this is the business side. And so Ms. Lindsley tomorrow will probably talk about agribusiness and how that starts to impact the changes of communities as well. So what we're also talking about here when we talk about those connections are this dependency. And so, my uncle could switch. He's like, well, if I'm not going to raise hogs, I've got great land here. He could then grow other crops. And so he had more variety. It wasn't as big a deal. But what you see here, look at this, that North America, we are not dependent on other countries in the region as far as our commodities. But take a look at sub-Saharan Africa. Part is go back to where I started. If we're talking about luxury crops, if we're talking about cocoa or tea or any of those plantation crops, it's great, but it's not going to sustain life. And so we then have to rely on these other countries. And so there's this interdependence that occurs. Think about this. So those of you that were with me a few weeks ago when we talked about trade, these two images I've used before, and we talk about the US exporting our product, and we're exporting for example, a ton of soybeans to China. They become reliant on us. We take a look at those exports, and we look at yes, we've seen it decrease because of tariffs, but what we're trying to link here are those trading patterns and that dependency. And that's really what this map is getting at here. That look at these regions of the world that are dependent on exports of agricultural products. If that product fails, there's a bad there's a drought, there's a tsunami, there's something that wipes it all out, there's some sort of a pest that comes and does that. How do they feed their people? And that, because then they're not selling their crop or their animal, and that's really where the concern and that dependence comes from. The other thing then is we're also, those areas are some of the areas that also are struggling with their caloric intake. And so we look at these areas that are not getting enough calories. We look at areas that are not that, look at this, 21% of all Africans eat less than the recommended amount. 52% of Haitians are undernourished. 191 million people in India are undernourished. So when we look at this and we look at these dependency areas, I mean, take a look, what happens when those things fail? And that's part of that dependency and things that we need to talk about. That is how agriculture and culture become connected. And that is that idea. Go back to when we talk about environmental pressures, farming in a warmer world. And so what we start to see here, guys, is that change in agricultural potential. We could lose what we're producing. And so we've got to start thinking more about sustainability. And so that's going to be some future lessons that we're going to talk about. So we're going to do a quick little check for understanding. I'm going to answer a question and then we'll do a check for understanding. So the question is, I probably should, I'm just going to turn this here. If sub-Saharan Africa is mostly subsistence cropping, how is their economy more dependent on crops? Subsistence agriculture is part of the informal economy, right? So there's a couple different things happening in Africa. So go back to that coffee and cocoa. So that doesn't feed their family. So then the subsistence in that informal is producing to feed them. And so if your cocoa fails, maybe I still have a little bit of food, but it makes it really difficult. There's an imbalance there. What can you conclude from these images? So things that you should think about when you look at this, you should probably think, first of all, MDC. Why? Look at the technology that's being used here, the machinery. Look at the wealth. You should look at the type of crop. So I could say this definitely is going to be more intensive. I could put this in ring 3 of the Van Thunen model. I'm going to be looking for typically, definitely, this is a wealthier country. I would assume that there's less people actually engaged in agriculture because the machines are doing the work. So they're probably in that stage 4 to 5 of the demographic transition model versus probably some sort of plantation. I would probably say that they're going to be in that tropical region. You can see tea on the right, and then we see cocoa farmers on the left. We can say that we're talking about definitely a lot of hand labor, manual labor. We typically, who's actually controlling that? They probably are subsistence farmers on the side just so that they can feed their families because you're not going to live off of these crops. So things to think about. And then I'll look at a couple questions. This is more for your teacher, so don't feel you need to look at it. That's really an overview of everything we did. I'm not going to read this to you, but I would say for your teachers, if they're looking at this, this is why I pulled what I pulled from those and put together the PowerPoint that I did. So here we go, the FRQ practice. There's 2 types of agriculture, so you want to identify the grain crop that's shown in each picture. Discuss 2 economic differences between subsistence agriculture and commercial agriculture. Identify 1 environmental impact resulting from the type of agriculture shown in photo Y, and identify 1 environmental impact resulting from the type of agriculture shown in photo Z. Ben, anything else, or does it look okay? No, Rimland, we would not go, that we'll go over in the political unit. So Rimland, Heartland, that's going to be in our political unit that will be starting Friday and Monday. So As Ben's kind of scrolling through, again, remember there's going to be more information coming about the AP exam. It's going to be, I promise you more stuff will come if you've got problems with technology. I would highly recommend if you have not gotten into AP Classroom in the last. Okay. So a lot of questions about how to get to AP Classroom. Let me look, see if I can find a link that I can kind of put on here for tomorrow. I'll be honest, I Google it all the time. I just put in AP Classroom, but you really want to make sure you're checking your password and your email so that you can get into it. Your teachers should have put you, that's how you registered for your AP exams in the fall. So definitely reach out to your teachers, but I Google it and I'll talk to my producer to see if there's something that we could put on our slides as well. Okay, I hope you had a great time. It's a unit that I'm clearly passionate about. I want to thank my son for helping me out as well. And I look forward to seeing you. I'm back on Friday. Miss Lindsley will be with you tomorrow to finish up agriculture with you guys. Have a great night, everybody.